Consider the famous Harvard marshmallow experiment, where children were given a choice between one marshmallow now or two later. And decades later, researchers discovered that those who waited often developed stronger discipline, deeper resilience, and greater success in life. What looked like a simple test of self-control was actually a revelation about delayed reward. And in many ways, your spiritual journey has mirrored that experiment more than you realized, because you were offered moments where giving up would have delivered immediate relief, while waiting required trust without visible evidence. And yet you chose to wait, to believe, to hold your ground even when the silence felt heavy. Patience was never passive for you. It was construction happening behind walls you could not see, beams being placed in the dark, foundations being poured beneath the surface of your awareness. What you called silence was not emptiness but strategic restraint, not distance but divine timing, calibrating the outcome so it would not crush you when it finally arrived. You were never wrong about God. You sensed movement even when circumstances contradicted it. You felt alignment even when reality looked stagnant. And that intuition was not imagination but spiritual perception waiting for confirmation. Now the turning point approaches quietly yet unmistakably, the quiet season loosening its grip, evidence beginning to surface, alignment becoming visible. If this message resonates with you, take a moment to anchor it by liking, sharing, or subscribing, and leave a comment declaring, "I trust the timing," because spoken agreement strengthens inner conviction, and your testimony may awaken someone else who is still standing in the silence wondering if it means anything at all. The silence was never empty, and as we move deeper, you will begin to see how the hidden strategy behind that silence was shaping you more precisely than any immediate breakthrough ever could. There was a season when your prayers felt like echoes thrown into a canyon with no return, when doors you believed were meant for you closed without explanation, when opportunities dissolved at the exact moment you thought they were finally solidifying. And in that season, confusion was not theoretical, but personal, emotional, and exhausting. You questioned your discernment, replayed conversations in your mind, wondered if you had misread signs or misunderstood timing, and the quiet that surrounded you was not peaceful meditation, but the kind that presses against your ribs and demands answers. Yet what felt like abandonment was actually calibration, the careful adjustment of internal alignment so that when movement began, it would not destabilize you. Because divine silence is rarely a withdrawal, and more often a recalibration of trajectory, a realignment of intention, a refinement of desire. The closed doors that bruised your confidence were protection from rooms that would have drained your calling. The losses that felt like subtraction were redirections clearing space for assignments that required clearer vision. And the disappointments you carried like small stones in your pocket were in fact edits in a larger script that refused to let you enter chapters before you had grown into the character capable of sustaining them. Delays have a way of exposing attachments you did not know you had. Attachments to validation, to timelines, to outcomes shaped more by expectation than by alignment. And as those attachments loosened, you felt instability because what you had leaned on was being removed. Yet, that removal was mercy, not cruelty, because discernment grows strongest when illusions dissolve. You began noticing patterns in hindsight, recognizing that some opportunities were impressive but not aligned. Some relationships were exciting but not anchored. Some ambitions were loud but not peaceful. And refinement sharpened your inner compass so that you could distinguish between what glittered and what grounded you. This is how tested trust forms. Not the naive confidence that assumes everything will move quickly, but the matured faith that survives unanswered prayers and still refuses to collapse. Your belief did not remain intact because circumstances supported it, but because something deeper than circumstance held you steady. And that is why your trust now feels different, less fragile, less dependent on applause or visible evidence, because it has been stretched without breaking. There were nights when you lay awake analyzing every possibility, trying to decode silence as if it were a puzzle you could solve through overthinking. And in those hours you learned that control is often an illusion disguised as responsibility. You discovered that surrender is not weakness but alignment, that stepping back from forced outcomes creates space for organic movement, and slowly you stopped demanding immediate explanations and began cultivating quiet resilience. The silence was not comfortable, but it was formative, chiseling away impatience, exposing fear, strengthening endurance, and teaching you that preparation does not always announce itself with excitement. Sometimes it arrives disguised as delay, disguised as boredom, disguised as waiting rooms where nothing appears to move. And now, as the layers begin to peel back, you can see glimpses of intention in what once looked random, noticing how specific disappointments protected you from deeper harm, how certain detours led you toward people and opportunities that resonate more authentically, how the very stillness you resented built capacity within you. This realization restores a powerful internal stability, a confidence rooted not in ego, but in experience, because you have walked through doubt without surrendering belief. You have endured silence without abandoning your sense of calling. And that endurance is evidence that the strategy behind the silence was always working in your favor. As that understanding settles, we move into the recognition of the spiritual backfire effect and the mental fatigue it created, because there was a point when, the harder you tried, the more resistance you felt. When every focused effort seemed to rebound into frustration, when discipline did not produce visible progress, and prayer did not produce immediate clarity. You intensified your routines, refined your habits, doubled your commitment, yet circumstances pushed back with equal force. And that paradox created an exhausting tension between effort and outcome. This backfire effect was not a sign that you were failing, but an indication that internal growth and external interference were colliding simultaneously. That while you were strengthening internally, unseen factors were rearranging externally, and the friction between those processes manifested as resistance. The mind, however, does not easily interpret friction as transformation. It interprets it as blockage. And so subtle narratives began forming in your thoughts. Maybe I misunderstood my calling. Maybe I overestimated my discernment. Maybe this delay means disapproval. And those narratives were convincing because fatigue amplifies doubt. Mental exhaustion is a powerful distorter of perception, making temporary stagnation feel permanent, making strategic delay feel like personal rejection. The real trap was not the circumstances around you, but the depletion within you, the gradual draining of emotional energy that made every obstacle appear larger than it was. And in that state, even minor setbacks felt like confirmations of fear. Yet divine rejection was never the source of your resistance. It was a compression cycle building pressure before release, a season where growth was happening beneath visible layers. When effort meets resistance repeatedly without visible reward, the mind seeks explanation, and if explanation is not offered externally, it invents one internally, which is how those false narratives gain strength. You questioned your intuition more harshly than you questioned God. You replayed your decisions more critically than you evaluated timing, and the internal dialogue became heavier than the external obstacles. But compression cycles are not permanent. They exist to concentrate focus, to intensify refinement, to build momentum beneath the surface until release becomes inevitable. And that release is now approaching as the constricted energy that once felt suffocating begins to dissolve. You may notice it first in subtle shifts, a lighter quality in your thoughts, decisions that once required days of analysis becoming clear within minutes, emotional reactions softening into observation rather than overreaction. Where once you chased validation, you now choose alignment. Where once you forced outcomes, you now allow organic movement. Where once doubt echoed loudly, now a quiet certainty hums beneath your actions. The backfire effect loses its power when internal alignment surpasses external interference, and that threshold has been crossed more than you realize. The cycle that replayed disappointment begins to fragment. Opportunities that once slipped through your hands linger long enough for you to grasp them. Conversations that stalled resume naturally, and the mental heaviness that once colored every plan begins lifting without dramatic announcement. This is how release often feels, not explosive but gradual, like fog thinning at sunrise until clarity appears almost unexpectedly. And in that clarity, you recognize that the silence trained you, the resistance strengthened you, and the fatigue humbled you without defeating you. You are stepping out of distortion and into alignment, out of exhaustion and into momentum. And the difference will not merely be visible in your circumstances, but tangible in your internal posture. because you no longer interpret delay as denial. You no longer mistake silence for absence, and you no longer allow mental fatigue to narrate your destiny. What once rebounded against you will now move forward with you, and as this compression collapses, you will understand that even the backfire effect was part of preparation, ensuring that when doors open, you step through them not desperate for validation, but grounded in clarity. Not driven by fear of missing out, but guided by intuitive conviction, ready not only to receive movement, but to sustain it. As you move forward from the collapse of that compression cycle, you begin to sense that you are standing inside a window of activation and energetic shift where stagnation no longer defines the atmosphere around you and forward momentum begins to feel natural rather than forced, because something subtle yet undeniable has changed in your internal landscape. The heaviness that once accompanied every decision has lightened, the constant second-guessing has softened, and instead of feeling like you are pushing against invisible resistance, you feel as though unseen barriers are quietly dissolving. What once felt like running on a treadmill now resembles stepping onto an open road, and this is not coincidence, but the closing of a spiritual compression cycle that had been building pressure beneath the surface of your life for longer than you realized. Compression is not destruction, it is concentration, and when concentration reaches its necessary threshold, expansion becomes inevitable. You are not entering expansion because you demanded it, but because you have been prepared to sustain it, and visible movement begins to mirror internal maturity in ways that feel synchronistic rather than chaotic. Emotional layers that once felt tangled and overwhelming now begin dissolving into understanding, and situations that used to trigger immediate reaction now invite calm reflection. You find yourself remembering old disappointments, not with bitterness, but with clarity, recognizing patterns without reliving pain. And that transformation marks heightened awareness rather than emotional suppression. Awareness does not erase memory, but refines interpretation. And through this refinement, you see how every delay, every misalignment, every uncomfortable pause served a precise purpose in shaping discernment within you. Random thoughts that once felt like background noise now carry weight. Subtle impressions that once seemed irrational now reveal themselves as intuitive nudges. And you begin to trust the quiet signals that rise from within, rather than the loud opinions that echo from outside. Intuition sharpens when fear subsides, and because the fog of mental fatigue has thinned, your perception regains its precision. Instead of reacting impulsively, you observe. Instead of chasing reassurance, you analyze alignment. Instead of overthinking, you notice patterns with calm confidence, and clarity quietly replaces reactivity as your default posture. You recognize now that resilience was spiritual confirmation in disguise, that the reason you could not completely give up during the silent season was because something within you was anchored to truth, even when evidence was absent. That quiet resilience was not stubbornness but confirmation, not denial, but faith tested in obscurity. As that awareness solidifies, it naturally ushers you into a phase of mental breakthrough and truth activation, where rapid realizations begin to surface with surprising intensity, almost as if a veil has been lifted from your perception, and you can see with sharper contrast than before. Moments that once confused you now resolve in seconds. Connections between events become obvious, and insights arrive fully formed rather than pieced together through exhaustion. It feels catalytic, as though your mind is catching up to what your spirit already knew, and misunderstandings that once lingered dissolve quickly under the light of comprehension. You suddenly see where you misplaced blame, where you internalized responsibility that was never yours, where you defended intentions that were not aligned with your well-being. Hidden motives reveal themselves not through confrontation, but through clarity, and you realize that truth does not always arrive dramatically, but often unfolds quietly through awareness that feels undeniable. Spiritual dissonance, that exhausting tension between what you believed internally and what you saw externally, begins dissolving as alignment between belief and visible evidence strengthens. The gap that once created frustration narrows, and circumstances start reflecting the faith you held privately. Delayed understanding gives way to instant awareness, and instead of revisiting old scenarios repeatedly in search of explanation, You grasp insight immediately, process it efficiently, and release it without emotional residue. Synchronicity replaces frustration, not because life becomes effortless, but because movement feels aligned rather than strained. Conversations happen at the right moment, confirmations appear without manipulation, and timing unfolds with precision that reassures rather than confuses. God's response in this phase does not manifest as a dramatic spectacle, but as synchronized timing that fits so seamlessly you almost miss how extraordinary it is. Doors open without chaos, messages arrive without chasing, and opportunities align with readiness in a way that feels measured rather than rushed. This synchronization strengthens confidence without inflating ego, because you understand that alignment is not self-manufactured, but divinely orchestrated, and you participate in it through obedience rather than control. As this clarity deepens, the inner voice that was once overshadowed by external noise begins taking authority, guiding you into a new phase of intuitive obedience, where decisions are no longer filtered primarily through comparison or approval, but through resonance. You begin noticing the difference between actions that expand your energy and those that drain it, between environments that inspire growth and those that subtly constrict your spirit. Choosing alignment over approval becomes less of a struggle and more of a natural inclination, because you have experienced the cost of misalignment and no longer romanticize external validation. You understand that applause without authenticity is hollow, and that direction guided by fear of rejection ultimately leads to exhaustion. Soul-led action contrasts sharply with externally pressured movement, and a distinction becomes clearer with each decision you make. When action originates from clarity, it feels grounded and sustainable, but when it originates from pressure, it feels hurried and unstable. You begin recognizing expansion signals, those subtle sensations of openness and peace that accompany aligned opportunities. And you also recognize heaviness signals, the quiet constriction that indicates misalignment, even when something appears attractive on the surface. Trusting these signals requires courage, because they often contradict conventional logic. Yet your experiences have taught you that ignoring them results in unnecessary detours. And so obedience to your inner guidance becomes a disciplined practice rather than a fleeting impulse. Momentum begins building organically when actions stem from clarity, not because you are forcing progress, but because alignment removes resistance. What once required excessive effort now unfolds with measured consistency, and the difference is palpable in your energy levels and emotional stability. You no longer measure success solely by speed, but by sustainability, understanding that rapid acceleration without foundation leads to burnout, while steady alignment produces lasting impact. External validation gradually loses its authority over your choices, and internal conviction rises in its place, not as arrogance but as quiet certainty that you are moving in harmony with something greater than public opinion. You no longer seek consensus before taking aligned steps, and you no longer interpret disagreement as proof of error. This internal shift prepares you for a relational realignment that influences not only romantic connections, but friendships, collaborations, and professional alliances, ushering you into a period where emotional depth, authenticity, and vulnerability increase naturally because you are no longer performing for acceptance. As relational space transforms, you notice that conversations carry more honesty, that walls soften without force, and that certain connections either deepen meaningfully or drift away without drama. Masks fall because pretense requires energy you are no longer willing to invest, and intentions clarify because ambiguity no longer feels tolerable. Emotional reassurance replaces insecurity as you begin understanding that relationships aligned with your next level will not require persuasion, and this clarity leads to a powerful instruction that reshapes your relational posture. Move toward those who choose you and release those who merely tolerate you. Choosing reciprocity over pursuit may feel uncomfortable at first, especially if you have been accustomed to proving your worth. But you begin recognizing that alignment thrives on mutual investment rather than imbalance. You stop convincing uncertain individuals and instead allow resonance to reveal itself through ease and consistency. This relational upgrade unfolds spiritually as you feel supported rather than questioned, emotionally as you feel understood rather than misinterpreted, and professionally as collaborations align more smoothly with shared vision rather than conflicting agendas. You become selective not out of fear, but out of wisdom, understanding that every connection influences direction. And because your direction is becoming clearer, you are less willing to compromise it for temporary approval. Allowing resonance instead of chasing validation transforms the relational dynamic from pursuit to magnetism. When you honor your own worth, aligned individuals recognize it without persuasion, and bonds form organically through shared alignment rather than forced compatibility. Vulnerability increases because fear of rejection decreases, and authenticity becomes the standard rather than the exception, creating space for deeper trust and more meaningful collaboration. In this realignment, you realize that divine timing influences relationships as precisely as it influences opportunities, and just as doors open at the right moment, connections either solidify or dissolve according to alignment rather than emotional impulse. You are not losing people, you are refining space, and that refinement ensures that those who remain are positioned to grow with you rather than hold you in past versions of yourself. This period invites you to observe relational patterns without judgment, to release attachments without resentment, and to embrace authenticity without apology. Because the same inner authority guiding your personal decisions now shapes your relational boundaries. You understand that protecting your peace is not selfish, but strategic, and that clarity in relationships strengthens clarity in purpose. Emotional depth no longer intimidates you, because you have navigated silence and resistance already, and vulnerability feels like strength rather than exposure. As alignment settles into your relational environment, you sense stability replacing unpredictability, reciprocity replacing imbalance, and encouragement replacing subtle undermining. And this shift reinforces everything you have learned about trusting internal guidance over external pressure. The silence trained you, the compression refined you, the backfire strengthened you, the breakthrough awakened you. And now this relational realignment positions you within an environment that mirrors your maturity rather than challenges it unnecessarily. You are not merely stepping into new opportunities, but into new relational ecosystems that support rather than sabotage your expansion. And because you have learned to choose alignment over approval, clarity over chaos, and resonance over validation, you are prepared to sustain what unfolds next. As you continue stepping forward in this recalibrated season, you begin to notice that sudden approvals and divine timing no longer feel like distant concepts, but lived experiences unfolding in real time. Because invitations that once seemed improbable begin arriving without dramatic build-up, confirmations that once felt delayed now appear almost effortlessly, and doors that previously resisted your effort open with a quiet inevitability that feels orchestrated rather than accidental. These unexpected invitations do not scream for attention. They appear at moments when your internal posture is steady, when you are no longer grasping desperately, but standing grounded. And that is precisely how divine timing reveals itself, not as chaotic interruption, but as synchronized arrival meeting readiness you cultivated in obscurity. You may receive a call that shifts your professional trajectory, an opportunity that aligns with skills you refined during silent seasons, a message that validates direction you doubted months ago. And while others may interpret these breakthroughs as luck, you recognize them as layered confirmation that preparation was never wasted. External breakthroughs become visible evidence of higher recognition, proof that unseen development has been acknowledged beyond your limited perspective, and each yes you receive carries more weight than mere approval. It confirms alignment between your growth and your assignment. You no longer interpret these openings as random fortune, but as alignment crystallizing into tangible opportunity. And this awareness strengthens courage, because you understand that hesitation now would contradict the maturity you built during waiting. The waiting season subtly transitions into a visible reward season, not because effort ceased, but because alignment matured to the point where fruit can sustain itself without collapsing under its own weight. And the confidence you feel is not inflated pride, but grounded certainty that you are stepping into spaces prepared specifically for you. Courage in this phase is not reckless enthusiasm, but calm willingness to walk through doors without demanding excessive proof, because the same intuition that sustained you in silence now guides you in motion. and the shift from obscurity to visibility feels less intimidating than you once imagined, since you know you have been strengthened precisely for this expansion. As this reward season unfolds, it naturally flows into a surge of focus, drive, and precision that characterizes the energy of bold, forward action, where you sense renewed determination, not fueled by desperation, but by clarity. Your attention sharpens, distractions lose their grip, and projects that once lingered in hesitation suddenly demand completion with a compelling urgency that feels constructive rather than anxious. This surge does not encourage reckless movement, but intentional precision, because courage without discernment leads to chaos, yet courage guided by clarity multiplies results. You begin structuring your days with renewed discipline, prioritizing tasks aligned with long-term vision rather than short-term gratification. And this recalibrated focus accelerates financial and professional progress in measurable ways. New income streams may surface unexpectedly, collaborations gain traction, delayed projects regain momentum, as if waiting for the exact internal alignment you now embody, and you sense that effort finally meets favorable timing rather than resistance. Energy in this phase functions both as reward and responsibility, because the same momentum that propels you forward requires stewardship. Acceleration demands maturity, and the drive you feel must be directed wisely to avoid scattering its potential. Decisive action becomes essential, not impulsive reaction, but deliberate movement grounded in strategy and intuition. And you realize that doors opening before you still require participation, because opportunity without action remains dormant potential. The importance of decisive movement cannot be overstated, since small, courageous steps taken now compound into exponential momentum, and hesitation risks dissipating the energy that has been carefully building beneath the surface of your life. You recognize that preparation has converged with opportunity in a way that demands engagement, because activation is not passive observation, but partnership with divine orchestration, and every intuitive nudge you feel now carries heightened significance, as if subtle guidance has grown louder precisely because you are ready to respond. Trusting these nudges as divine signals requires humility and courage simultaneously. Humility to acknowledge that guidance exceeds your limited foresight, and courage to act before every variable is visible. You begin taking aligned risks not recklessly, but confidently, aware that stagnation is no longer protective, but restrictive. Seizing aligned risks creates tangible transformation, and you notice that even modest actions generate disproportionate impact, as though momentum has been waiting for your participation to accelerate fully. Emails sent, proposals submitted, conversations initiated, boundaries set, all contribute to a trajectory that feels both intentional and supported. The convergence of preparation and opportunity reveals something profound about your journey, that readiness itself is proof of spiritual maturity, because you would not recognize these openings if you had not grown through silence, and you would not sustain them if you had not been refined through compression. You see now that nothing was premature, that every delay prevented misalignment, and that every lesson strengthened capacity, so expansion would not overwhelm you. This recognition brings you full circle to the realization that patience indeed produced fulfillment, just as the metaphor of delayed gratification illustrated at the beginning of your journey, because waiting did not weaken you, but fortified you for sustainable growth. The silence was strategic, not punitive, a carefully measured pause that ensured when movement arrived, it would align seamlessly with who you had become, and spiritual dissonance that once exhausted you has ended, replaced by harmony between belief and evidence. Confidence returns, not as fragile optimism, but as grounded declaration that you knew something unseen was working all along, that the intuition you guarded through doubt was accurate, that the quiet resilience you carried was confirmation rather than delusion. You find yourself thinking, "I knew it, I felt it." Not with arrogance, but with relief, because validation no longer depends solely on external applause, but on internal alignment, finally mirrored in visible circumstances. This restoration of confidence invites you to share testimonies rather than hide transformation, to acknowledge shifts rather than minimize them, and to remain aligned rather than reverting to old patterns of over-analysis. Your journey now becomes an encouragement to others still standing in silence, and your visible progress becomes evidence that strategic delay can produce extraordinary alignment when met with faith and perseverance. You are reminded that divine design rarely conforms to immediate gratification, but always aligns with sustainable fulfillment. And as confirmations continue unfolding, you recognize that delay was never denial but development, never punishment but preparation, never absence but orchestration beyond your limited perception. Confirmation is now unfolding in layers rather than bursts, steady rather than chaotic, reinforcing the truth that timing calibrated through patience yields outcomes far richer than impulsive action ever could. The silence strengthened you, the resistance refined you, the breakthrough awakened you, the approvals validated you, the momentum empowered you, and the convergence now activates you into sustained expansion that reflects both divine orchestration and personal participation. You stand not as someone rescued from failure, but as someone matured through process, not as someone lucky, but as someone aligned. And this alignment becomes the foundation upon which future chapters will build without collapsing under pressure. The story you once questioned now reads coherently when viewed from this vantage point, and the narrative that seemed fragmented reveals deliberate structure when observed through hindsight illuminated by clarity. You were right about the promise that whispered beneath the noise, right about the calling that persisted despite doubt, right about the timing that felt delayed but never abandoned. And as you step fully into this phase, you carry both humility and authority, understanding that growth required surrender, while expansion requires participation. The delay was divine design, confirmation is unfolding, and you move forward no longer asking whether silence meant something, but knowing it shaped everything.